Imagine for a second, right, that you are miles deep into an old-growth forest. You're completely disconnected from the modern world.
No cell signal at all.
Exactly. No cell signal, no distant glow of city lights, literally no paved roads anywhere. And at first, that kind of isolation feels like, I don't know, the ultimate escape from the noise of daily life.
It's what people want when they go out there.
Right. But then as you stand there, just absorbing the environment, you start to notice this profound silence around you. And you realize, very suddenly, that this absolute heavy silence isn't peaceful at all. It's actually incredibly threatening.
Because, well, in the natural world, a complete acoustic vacuum is rarely a sign of tranquility. It's actually an evolutionary indicator that the ecosystem has detected an apex anomaly.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the environment isn't resting, it's holding its breath.
And that terrifying realization that moment you understand the woods have gone completely quiet for a reason, that is the core of what we're unpacking today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Glad to be here for this one. It's a fascinating topic.
It really is. Our focus today is a deeply unsettling firsthand account from an interview transcript we pulled from a series called Beyond the Grave.
Right, the hiker.
Yeah, we're looking at the testimony of a backpacker named Rohan. He experienced something on the Appalachian Trail that honestly fundamentally broke his understanding of the natural order.
And we should clarify, we're using this specific encounter not just as some spooky ghost story.
Right, it's definitely not.
We're looking at it as a complex case study in survival psychology. We really want to deconstruct the mechanics of primal fear and, the incredible lengths our brains will go to rationalize danger.
Like what physically happens to our cognitive processing when an environment we think we understand just begins to operate totally outside the laws of nature.
Exactly.
So whether you're an avid backpacker who practically lives out of a tent or, someone who strictly prefers the locked doors and safety of a city apartment, this deep dive is going to fundamentally change how you perceive isolation.
And to really grasp that, we need to start by examining the biology of the environment itself.
Yeah, lay the groundwork.
Right, because before any physical threat even presented itself, the forest was already triggering these massive biological red flags for Rohan.
The setting is just so crucial to the psychological baseline here. We're looking at the Appalachian Trail in late October. It's 2 years ago. The foliage is decaying, the trees are dropping their leaves, and the ground is covered in this really dense, dry layer of organic material.
Which means every step a hiker takes in that environment creates a sharp, unmistakable acoustic signature. I mean, you're broadcasting your presence to a radius of several hundred yards with every step.
And Rohan describes this perfectly in his interview. He talks about how beautiful the orange dying trees looked, but how, deafening his own footsteps were as the leaves crunched underfoot.
But the real anomaly wasn't his noise.
No, it was the fact that the deeper he hiked into the trail, the quieter everything else became. He described it as this pervasive feeling that something was just missing.
Right, no birds calling.
Yeah, no birds, no hum of insects in the brush, just a dead, suffocating quiet.
And to understand why that specific type of silence induces such acute anxiety, we really have to look at how the human auditory system evolved. We are hardwired to continuously process what ecologists call biophony.
Biophony, right. That's like the background noise, right?
Yeah, it's the collective acoustic output of a given environment. So the constant background noise of crickets, frogs, birds, all of that acts as a biological all-clear signal.
A decentralized alarm network.
Precisely. As long as the local wildlife is vocalizing, your subconscious knows that those animals don't perceive an immediate proximal threat.
That makes perfect sense. The forest is essentially broadcasting a continuous signal that says, business as usual, you are safe.
Right.
So when that drops out, it's not just an absence of sound, it's the literal presence of an alarm. It actually reminds me a lot of the brilliant way sound designers manipulate audiences in suspense movies.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Yeah. You'll have a scene with a low, tense ambient track, maybe the sound of wind or, distant traffic. And right before the terrifying reveal, the audio track just drops out entirely, muted.
And your stomach just drops.
Exactly. The sudden absolute drop in ambient noise makes every muscle in your body tense up. You don't even need to see a monster to know the rules of the scene just changed.
And that cinematic technique works precisely because it hijacks our oldest survival hardware. When the biophony of a forest drops to zero, it means a predator or an unrecognized threat has entered the acoustic zone.
The wildlife has gone into a state of freeze or hide.
Right. And the human amygdala, which is the part of the brain responsible for processing fear and threat detection, it registers that sudden absence of pattern as a high alert anomaly.
So Rohan felt like something was missing because his brain was literally screaming that the environment's early warning system had enforcibly shut down.
Exactly. And his brain's reaction to that silent alarm introduces one of the most fascinating contradictions in human psychology.
How we process undeniable threats when we feel trapped.
Right. Because as the silence deepens into that first night, the psychological friction really begins.
Yeah, let's get into night one. Rohan sets up his tent near a shelter area. It's around midnight, and the silence is suddenly broken by footsteps.
But not normal footsteps.
No, he doesn't describe the quick, erratic scurrying of a raccoon or even like the clumsy shuffling of a bear. He describes slow, heavy, deliberate steps pacing in a perfect circle around his tent.
And the cadence of movement is a dead giveaway of intent out there.
How so?
Well, a foraging animal moves with a highly variable rhythm. Stopping to sniff, scratching at the dirt, changing direction based on a scent it picked up.
Right, they're distracted.
Exactly. But slow, deliberate pacing, maintaining an equidistant radius around a target, that implies calculated observation. It's a deliberate assessment of a stationary object.
Wow. And Rohan's immediate reaction is to try and establish communication. He assumes it's just another hiker who wandered off the trail, so he calls out into the dark.
Which is a natural human response.
But the moment he speaks, the footsteps stop completely. There's no verbal response, no sound of someone retreating, just instant frozen silence. He even unzips the tent flap, sweeps his flashlight across the tree line, and sees absolutely nothing.
And this creates a severe state of cognitive dissonance for him.
Right.
Cognitive dissonance occurs when the brain is forced to hold two entirely contradictory pieces of information simultaneously.
So on one hand, his ears are telling him there's a massive, heavy entity capable of deliberate stalking just outside.
Right. And on the other hand, his visual cortex is reporting totally empty space. The flashlight shows nothing.
The brain must just hate that.
It despises this kind of unresolved data because it can't formulate a clear survival plan.
See, if I'm in that situation, my immediate instinct tells me I'm packing up my gear and sprinting in the opposite direction immediately.
Oh, absolutely.
But Rohan does something that on the surface sounds totally irrational. He stays. He lies back down, closes his eyes, and literally tells himself he's just overthinking the wind or a deer or his own exhaustion. Why didn't he just pack up and leave right then? He actively gaslights his own survival instincts.
I know, it seems crazy. But while it seems completely irrational from the safety of our studio, his reaction is actually a textbook example of normalcy bias.
Normalcy bias.
Yes, it's an incredibly powerful, deeply ingrained survival mechanism. Normalcy bias is basically the brain's way of overriding terrifying sensory input to maintain operational calm and conserve metabolic energy.
Because the nearest exit was miles away.
Exactly. You have to factor in his physical reality. He is miles deep in the wilderness. It is pitch black. The terrain is super uneven and littered with trip hazards.
So a panicked flight response in the dark could easily result in a broken ankle or a fall down a ravine or, eventually succumbing to hypothermia.
Precisely. Panic is energetically expensive and highly, highly dangerous. The brain's executive functioning center, the prefrontal cortex, it rapidly calculates the immense physical risk of fleeing blindly through the woods against the ambiguous risk of the unseen footsteps.
So to prevent a dangerous panicked flight, the brain actively constructs a comforting, normalized narrative.
Right. It suppresses the amygdala's fear signals by basically insisting, it's just a deer, you are safe, go back to sleep.
It's a calculated gamble.
Choosing the lesser of two perceived evils to avoid the immediate known dangers of the environment.
The brain forces a state of denial just to keep the body physically intact for the night. That is wild.
It is.
But that fragile architecture of denial, it can really only hold up for so long. Because a normalcy bias requires at least a shred of ambiguity to work.
You can convince yourself a footstep is just a deer.
Right. But you cannot normalize what happens to Rohan when the isolation shifts into direct proximal escalation on the second night.
Because the entity begins testing the boundaries of his psychological defenses.
And it crosses that boundary hard. The next night, the tension is just suffocating. Rohan is already deeply sleep deprived. The heavy footsteps return, but the distance collapses. The pacing stops not at the edge of the campsite, but right beside him.
It's right there.
He describes hearing heavy, slow, labored breathing. It sounds like something massive is standing just inches from his head, separated only by the impossibly thin nylon wall of his tent.
A tent is a really fascinating psychological construct.
Because it's basically paper.
Exactly. Physically, a few millimeters of nylon provide zero structural protection against any large predator or threat. It cannot stop teeth, claws, mass, nothing. It is purely a visual barrier.
Yeah.
Yet humans treat it as an impenetrable fortress because it delineates the known, controlled space of the interior from the chaotic, unknown space of the exterior.
It really is the ultimate manifestation of a childhood blanket.
Oh, absolutely.
You know the instinct. When you're a kid lying in the dark and you are absolutely convinced there's a monster in the corner of your bedroom, what do?
You pull the covers up.
You pull the comforter over your head. It's this profound, completely irrational belief that if you sever the visual connection to the threat somehow ceases to exist in your reality.
And that is exactly what happens to our neurobiology under extreme prolonged stress. When the prefrontal cortex, which is the logical adult part of the brain, when that is overwhelmed by terror, it essentially shuts down.
It just taps out.
Yep. Cognitive processing regresses, and the limbic system, our primitive emotional core, takes the wheel. We basically revert to infantile coping mechanisms. This is known in psychology as the ostrich effect.
Like hiding your head in the sand.
Exactly. As long as Rohan doesn't look outside the tent, the breathing entity remains a sort of Schrodinger's threat. It is simultaneously real and unreal. Confirming it visually would make it an inescapable, undeniable fact, which would force his brain to process the impending trauma.
And the entity clearly understands this boundary because it doesn't try to tear the tent open. It leans down directly behind Rohan's head and it whispers.
That detail is just
terrifying. Rohan is explicit in the source that the phonetic sounds were not human. He couldn't decipher a language, just the low, vibrating hum of vocal cords imitating speech right beside his ear. And still, paralyzed by that limbic system regression, he refuses to look. He stays frozen under his sleeping bag until...
And we have to talk about that whisper. A whisper is a profound escalation.
Really? More than a growl?
Oh, definitely. A growl is a warning. A roar is an assertion of dominance. But a whisper implies a deliberate modulation of volume designed for a specific proximal listener.
Wow.
It implies advanced intelligence and, honestly, a sadistic awareness of the victim's psychological state. The entity is demonstrating that it knows exactly where he is, and it's actively choosing to prolong the terror rather than initiate a physical attack.
That brings us to the complete collapse of Rohan's psychological defenses, because on the third night, that psychological defense mechanism shatters. The blanket is finally ripped away.
The visual barrier fails.
The psychological barrier of the tent cannot hold back visual confirmation forever. On the third night, Rohan is jolted awake. He finally looks out through the mesh window of the tent, out into the tree line, and the ambiguity ends. He sees the silhouette standing among the trees.
And the way he articulates the physical traits of this entity in the transcript is critical, because his brain is desperately trying to map this visual input onto known biological templates, and it is failing entirely.
Yeah, he uses specific descriptors that are just chilling. He says the shadow was, quote, too tall. He says it was too still. And he says its head was tilted at an unnatural angle.
The stillness is key there.
Right, and he couldn't make out any distinct facial features in the darkness, but he had this absolute certainty that the entity was smiling at him.
Let's break down the mechanics of that stillness first. In the animal kingdom, perfect immobility is extremely difficult to maintain. It requires immense muscular control.
Animals are always twitching or shifting.
Exactly. When an animal freezes, it is either prey attempting to blend into the background to avoid detection, or it is a predator locked into an ambush posture, building kinetic potential for a strike.
So building up energy to pounce.
Right. So given the prolonged stalking over the previous nights, Rohan's brain instantly categorizes this absolute statue-like stillness as an advanced predatory tactic.
And what about the certainty of the smile? How does a brain register an expression it can't physically see because he said it had no visible face?
That ties into a neurological phenomenon called pareidolia, combined with our evolutionary hypersensitivity to facial cues.
Pareidolia, like seeing faces in clouds.
Exactly. The human brain dedicates a massive amount of processing power to identifying faces and interpreting their intent. We look for micro-expressions to gauge empathy, aggression, deceit.
So his brain was filling in the blanks.
Yes. When Rohan perceives a smile in the darkness, his subconscious is likely reading subtle postural cues, tilt of the head, the relaxation of the shoulders, the angle of the jawline.
But a smile isn't friendly in this context.
Not at all. In the wild, among predators, a smile does not denote friendliness. It is the baring of teeth. It is an evolutionary display of supreme confidence and dominance. The entity is projecting that it is entirely in control of the situation.
And that dominance display becomes terrifyingly kinetic. Just a moment later, the silhouette finally moves. But Rohan specifically notes in the source that it didn't walk. He describes it as gliding.
Gliding.
Yeah, it glided out of the tree line and closed the distance to his tent in seconds.
And that detail is so important because walking is a mechanical, somewhat inefficient process. It involves a shifting center of mass, the rising and falling of the hips and shoulders, the vertical oscillation of the body literally pushing against gravity.
Nice clunky.
Right. So when an observer sees something move without that characteristic bobbing motion, when it just glides smoothly across uneven debris-covered terrain, it violates our intuitive understanding of physics.
Our brain's physics engine basically rejects the input.
Exactly. This unnatural locomotion triggers a deep, visceral revulsion because it signals that the entity is not bound by the same physical constraints we are.
And then it glides right up to the mesh of the tent, it crouches down, and it does the one thing that shatters the final illusion of safety. It physically taps on the fabric.
Just a tap.
Just a tap. And a physical tap is a masterclass in psychological warfare.
It really is. A curious animal might sniff the fabric or swipe at it with a paw. But a tap is a measured, rhythmic application of force.
It's almost polite.
Polite and completely mocking. It is the entity declaring the visual barrier is gone. The physical barrier means nothing. I can touch you whenever I choose.
And Rohan's reaction is exactly what you would expect when the normalcy bias violently disintegrates. The prefrontal cortex completely short circuits.
He doesn't rationalize anymore.
No, he doesn't pack his bag. He doesn't look for the trail. He abandons his direction entirely. He bursts out of the tent and sprints blindly into the pitch black forest, crashing through the underbrush, entirely consumed by the exact panicked flight response his brain had been trying to prevent for 3 days.
Because the known proximal threat of the entity finally outweighed the environmental dangers of the dark woods.
But the terror doesn't end with his escape. Because as he's tearing through the woods, lungs burning, branches whipping his face, he realizes he is being chased. He can hear the heavy, deliberate footsteps crashing through the brush right behind him.
But the mechanism of the chase is what makes this account so uniquely disturbing.
Yeah, Rohan states that the entity matched his frantic pace perfectly, step for step, but it never actually closed the distance to catch him. And then suddenly, at the edge of a ridgeline, the footsteps behind him just abruptly stopped.
And from an ecological perspective, that behavior completely defies the logic of predation.
Why is that?
Because predators are fundamentally bound by the laws of energy conservation. If a wolf, a bear, or a mountain lion decides to expend the massive amount of calories required to chase down prey, the singular goal is to close the distance as efficiently as possible, neutralize the target, and consume those calories to recoup the energetic loss.
Right, a predator doesn't jog behind its dinner just to keep it company.
Exactly. Matching the pace of a fleeing target without overtaking it requires a continuous, deliberate throttling of speed. It is a massive waste of energy if the goal is consumption.
So the goal was never consumption.
No. Therefore, the goal was behavioral herding.
It's the equivalent of a sheepdog driving a flock, but infinitely more malicious. The entity was applying constant, terrifying acoustic pressure to Rohan's back, ensuring he didn't slow down, ensuring he didn't try to turn around or establish a defensive position.
It was using his own absolute terror to physically drive him out of the territory.
It's an assertion of absolute territorial dominance, like playing cat and mouse. The entity wanted him gone, and it utilized a calculated escalation of psychological trauma to ensure that the eviction was permanent.
And it worked flawlessly.
It did. In the conclusion of his interview, Rohan makes it explicitly clear that his worldview has been permanently fractured. He states with chilling certainty that the entity stalking him was neither human nor any known animal. And when asked if he will ever set foot on a wilderness trail again, his answer is a definitive never.
He experienced a paradigm shift that just cannot be undone. He realized that the unspoken social contracts and physical laws that govern our modern lives, they evaporate the moment we step off the pavement.
And that is the crucial takeaway for you, the listener, as we wrap up this deep dive. We often venture into the deep woods seeking isolation. We want to strip away the watchful eyes of society, The incessant pinging of cell phones, the suffocating architecture of cities.
We romanticize the wilderness as a peaceful, passive backdrop for our recreation.
We really do. We walk among these ancient, towering trees with the quiet arrogance of a species that believes it sits permanently at the absolute top of the food chain.
We assume that because we mapped the terrain, we somehow domesticated the environment.
But Rohan's ordeal violently dismantles that arrogance. It forces us to confront the reality of our own fragility. When the baseline biophony drops out and the woods go completely, unnervingly silent, you are forced to realize that you are not a conqueror in that space. You are a profoundly vulnerable visitor in an ecosystem that operates on rules older than human civilization.
And sometimes, the indigenous architecture of that forest simply does not let you know.
Which leaves us with a deeply unsettling question to consider. We analyze the final moments of Rohan's frantic sprint through the dark, the heavy footsteps crashing through the brush, matching his desperate pace stride for stride.
An entity fully capable of overtaking him but actively choosing not to.
And then, the sudden silent cessation of the chase the moment he crosses a geographical threshold. Rohan believes he ran fast enough to escape with his life. But when you look at the calculated, sadistic intelligence behind every single interaction,
From the slow, hypnotic pacing, to the whispered intimidation, to the mocking tap on the nylon.
did the entity suddenly stop at the edge of the dark woods because Rohan successfully escaped its grasp?
Or did it stop because it had successfully herded him exactly where it wanted him to be?
Next time you find yourself miles deep in an isolated forest and the ambient hum of the insects suddenly drops to a dead silence, you might want to stop and ask yourself who is actually dictating your next move.